Welcome to Beaducation.com. My name is Colin Mahler and we are going to be doing the Orbital ring chain today. This is a very simple chain. It starts off very simply and it gets a little more complicated as we add the orbiting rings into the chain. Highly recommend that you watch the entire video all the way through before you actually start so you know exactly what you're getting into. And let's begin. Here are the materials we will be using today to make our orbital ring chain. We are going to be using about 100 if you're making a bracelet and about 200 if you're making a necklace of the 5.5 millimeter 16 gauge jump rings, and the 5.5 millimeter measurement is taken on the inside diameter of the jump ring and not the outside diameter. And we're going to be using some pre-oxidized rings and some shiny rings filming this class today in the hopes that it will be easier to actually see what I'm doing. If you're buying the optional kit for this class, you will only be getting the shiny rings, not the pre-oxidized rings. If you want oxidized rings, you're going to have to buy some liver of sulfur and oxidize them yourself. We are also going to be using about 4 of the 3 millimeter, also inside diameter, 18 gauge jump rings to attach our clasp to the ends of our chain. You'll need 1 paper clip and 1 clasp. This is just a simple toggle clasp. You can use any type of clasp you want on the end of this chain, a box clasp or a spring ring or whatever you like, but we'll just be using a toggle for today. And you will be getting a toggle if you buy the optional kit. The tools you will need to make your orbital ring chain today are 1 pair of bent chain nose pliers and 1 pair of regular chain nose pliers. So the tools that we're going to be using today, if you're not overly comfortable or familiar with using 2 tools at the same time, this may take a little bit of getting used to. I am using my bent chain nose plier in my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand, and the tips of my bent chain nose plier are pointed towards the outside of my hand. This will keep the tips out of my way while leaving me a whole lot of plier surface to work with. I don't want to use my bent chain nose pliers like this because the tips will just end up being more in my way as opposed to out of my way. And I have my regular chain nose pliers in my right hand, which is my dominant hand. And I am holding both of these pliers with my thumbs on top of the pliers. This is the most comfortable way to go. It's also going to keep your thumbs out of each other's, out of your own, it's going to keep your thumbs out of your own way so you're not constantly bumping into your own knuckles, and you'll have a little more control and comfort while using your pliers. So the first thing we need to start with is learning how to properly open and close our jump rings. Now I have my bent chain nose pliers in my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand, and I have my chain nose pliers in my right hand, which is my dominant hand. And I'm going to place my jump ring into my bent chain nose pliers with the opening up at the 12 o'clock position. And I'm going to get a nice firm grip. Now don't squeeze too tight with your pliers when you're holding onto your jump rings. You just need a firm grip but not death grip. Otherwise you are more likely to shoot your jump rings out of your pliers than get a nice firm grip on them. And you want to also make sure that you're holding on to at least half of your jump ring with your pliers. You don't want to come in with the tips of your pliers or you're going to end up warping your jump rings. So I have my jump ring in my pliers, the opening's at the 12 o'clock position. I'm going to grab the other side of the jump ring with my chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to give that half of the jump ring a quarter twist away from me and open up my jump ring nice and big. So let's open 1 more jump ring. We're going to get in a little bit closer here with the camera so you can see a little better. Once again, I've placed my jump ring in my bent chain nose pliers with the opening up here at the 12 o'clock position. And I'm going to grab the other side of that jump ring with my chain nose pliers and give it a quarter turn away from me. And voila, I have opened my jump ring. Next, we're going to learn how to properly close a jump ring. Once again, I have placed my jump ring in my bent chain nose pliers with the opening up at the 12 o'clock position. Going to grab the other side of my jump ring with my chain nose pliers And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rock the two ends of this jump ring back and forth, and there's a very tiny space in between the two ends of the jump ring that I need to close up as I'm rocking the ends closer to each other. So as you're doing this, you're applying a very gentle inward pressure, trying to get rid of that little tiny gap between the two ends of your jump ring. So I've got a firm grip on both sides of my jump ring with both of my pliers, and I'm going to rock both ends of the jump ring back past the point where they meet. I'm going to rock back again, and one more time, and if you just heard that little click, that was the two ends of the jump ring hitting each other. So I know that the two ends are nice and flush, close together. Now I'm just going to wiggle the two ends of the ring until they both line up. Like so, and I have a nicely closed ring. It does take a little bit of practice to get your jump rings nicely closed, so if you haven't completely closed up that gap between the two ends, that will just take a little bit more practice. Okay, so we're going to close one more jump ring, and we're going to get in really close with the camera so you can see a little bit better. Once again, I have my jump ring in my bent chain nose pliers, the opening up at the 12 o'clock position. Grab the other side of my jump ring with my regular chain nose pliers, and I'm going to rock both the ends of this jump ring back past the point where they meet, back again, and time just to make sure that they're nice and flush. And I'm just going to wiggle them into place so that both ends line up with each other, like so. So to begin, you are going to need to close about half of your jump rings and go ahead and open up the other half, so about 50 open and 50 closed. So the first thing we need to do to start this chain is to make a simple 2x2 chain, which simply means that there's two jump rings attached to two jump rings attached to two jump rings all the way along. So this is just a very simple basic chain that we're going to start with. And we're going to start by creating little units that we're going to connect together to create the one long chain. So you're going to start with one open jump ring, and you're going to link 4 of your closed jump rings onto that one open ring. Then go ahead and close that up. Like so. Then you're going to take one more open ring, and you're going to go through all 4 of those closed jump rings that you just added to the single ring, and then you're going to close this ring up. So you should have something that looks like this. You should have 4 jump rings attached to 2 jump rings. And if you separate out 2 of those 4 closed rings and let everything fall, you'll have a little section of 2 and 2 chain that's 3 links long. So you're going to go ahead and make about 7 of these little sections of chain, doing the same thing. 1 open jump ring, add 4 jump rings onto it, 4 closed rings onto it. Go ahead and close that ring up. Oops. Then you're going to take a second open jump ring, and once again link it through the 4 closed jump rings. Separate out 2 of the 4 closed jump rings, let everything fall, and you have another little section of the 2 and 2 chain. And you're going to go ahead and once you have about 7 of these little sections made, you may need a couple more depending on the length of your wrist and how long you need your chain to be. Once you have all those done, we're going to start connecting them together. So I'm going to take one of the little sections that I just made and an open jump ring, and I'm going to put the one pair on the very end of this little section onto the open jump ring. Take another of your little sections and link that onto the open jump ring as well. And close it up. And then we're going to add a second open jump ring to connect these two little sections together. Close that one up. And you're just going to keep on connecting all your little sections of chain together until you get a length of chain that is about 1 inch longer than you want your final finished length of chain to be. So I wear about a 7-inch bracelet. I'm going to make this chain about 8 inches long. So here's my finished 2x2 chain, and I have made it about 7.5 inches long. Because I will be adding a clasp to this, which will take up about a 1/2 inch or so of length. So I don't want to make this chain a full 8 inches long. Even though it will shrink up, I still need to add the clasp, so keep that in mind as you're making this chain. Now, if you have added all your little units together and they are not quite long enough, you can go ahead and add on a little bit of length at the end just by using a couple of your open jump rings, and you're just going to link through the pair of rings at the very end of your chain. And there's one jump ring on the end, and here's a second open jump ring going through the same 2 links on the end of the chain. So I've just added an extra pair of rings on the very end of my chain just to give me a little bit extra length. So this chain is very easy to adjust the length on even as you're going through and adding the orbiting rings. If you start to notice that as you get towards the end that this chain is going to end up being a little bit too long, you can also go and take off links before you finish the chain. And if it turns out that it's not quite long enough, then you can, of course, go ahead and add a couple extra links onto the end. Our next step is going to be to actually add the orbiting rings into our chain, which will give the chain the pattern. And I'm going to be using shiny rings to add these orbiting rings in. Hopefully you will be able to see a little better what I'm doing with the contrast between the oxidized and the shiny rings. And I also have attached a paper clip to the very end of my chain. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does give me a little something extra to hang on to as I start adding these orbiting rings. And it kind of gives me a reference point as to what end I am working on. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this very first pair of rings and move on to the next pair, the second pair away from the paper clip. And I'm going to sort of press down on the 2 rings and sort of slide them apart so that there's a space created between the 2 jump rings above and below both the jump rings. There's also a common, excuse me, there's also a common center in between the 2 jump rings, as well as the 2 spaces that are created as you slide these apart. And what I'm going to do is I want to take an open jump ring, and I'm going to slide either end of this jump ring into the 2 spaces that I've created by sliding these 2 jump rings apart. So I'm going to put one end of my jump ring into that top space, and once I get it in there, I'm going to kind of turn that jump ring a little bit so that I fit the other end into the space below the 2 jump rings. So I've just slid it in there. I haven't closed it yet, and I'm holding the chain taut so it's going to hold that ring in place. Now I'm going to turn the chain over so that I can get at both of the ends. And I'm going to go ahead and close that ring up. And I have added my first orbiting ring into the chain. Now we're going to be adding these orbiting rings to every other set of rings. So I'm going to skip this next pair of rings and go ahead and add my next orbiting ring. Now what you want to keep in mind as you're adding these rings in is that when you go to slide these two rings apart to create your two little spaces, you want to make sure that you're always sliding these two rings in the same direction. Otherwise it kind of messes up your chain. So if I were to slide this in the opposite direction, it totally twists my chain, so the chain will not lay flat if you reverse the direction that you slide these two rings apart in. So here I have slid them apart going in the same direction. The top ring is going up and away, and the bottom ring, the underneath ring, is coming from the bottom here. So I'm pressing down on these two jump rings, creating the space above and below, that common space between the two. And I'm going to grab another open ring. And once again, I'm going to fit one end of my jump ring into the space above the two rings. And I'm going to turn it around, fit the other end into the space below the two rings. Oops, and it just popped out. So there we go. I'm going to flip it over. Oops, even though that just popped out again. And now that I've flipped the chain over, grabbing both the ends of this jump ring with my pliers, going to go ahead and close it up. Like so. Okay, so that's one method of adding your orbiting rings. If that one isn't working for you, I have another one. This is a little bit tricky, so take a deep breath and have some patience. So here I'm going to slide my tip, skip this pair of rings, and go move to my next pair of rings. I've slid these two rings apart. Now with my open jump ring, I'm going to feed one end of the jump ring into the bottom space created between my two rings here. And I'm going to feed about half the ring down through that space. I'm going to take it and twist it and turn it up, and as I do so, if everything works out well, the other end of that jump ring should come up from underneath through this other space, like so. And go ahead and close it up. Okay, so you want to see that one again? Let's do that again. So again, I'm skipping the pair of rings right next to my orbiting ring. Move on to the next pair. Slide them apart. Grab your open jump ring. Now I'm going in through what I consider the bottom space. You can go in through the top space if that seems easier to you. I always go through the bottom, and by the bottom I mean the space that's closest to me. So I'm going to feed, again, about half that jump ring in to that space. I'm going to turn it around and feed the other end back up through that top space. That's a tricky little maneuver because you do sometimes end up getting caught up on the pairs of rings to either side of the pair that you're actually working on. So watch that as you're turning that ring around. And go ahead and close this. Now by using this a different method, I've switched the openings of my jump rings from the back of my chain to the top of my chain. These rings are going to move, so it doesn't really matter where the openings of your jump ring end up. So there you go. Now using one of these two methods, whichever one works best for you, you're going to continue working all the way down the end of the chain, adding your orbiting rings. And you want to make sure that when you get to the end of the chain that you have an empty pair of rings at the very end of the chain and you're not ending on an orbital ring. Now if you're having troubles getting these orbiting rings in by using your pliers, you can go ahead and try using your fingers to pick up the orbiting ring and put it into place. However, there's so many different ways of getting this done. Find the way that's most comfortable for you, whether you're using your pliers or your hands or laying it down on the table. Whatever works for you, find your method. What really matters is that you get the rings where they're supposed to be and the chain looks like it's supposed to when it's finished. So I'm going to go ahead, spread these two rings apart, and I'm going to feed the one end of that ring into the top space and turn it around, feed it the other end of the ring into the bottom space. And I'm going to pick up my pliers because that's just easier for me. Oh, there we go. Now I have all of this, the chain and the links that I'm working on are braced against the index finger of my left hand. I'm also holding the chain rather taut so this ring doesn't have too much of a chance to slip out of place. Now I'm going to go ahead and hold that orbiting ring with my thumb as I flip it over. And I'm going to scoot this ring around so that I have room to grab the ends of the ring with my pliers. And go ahead and close. Of course, you're going to have to use your pliers to open and close your jump rings because your fingers just won't be strong enough. At least mine aren't. And there you go. So here's my finished piece of chain, and I have made it a little bit too long because the chain itself here ends at about 7 inches. And bracelets that I usually wear are 7 inches total, which includes the clasp. So I'm going to go ahead and undo some of this length so I can add my clasp and have my bracelet fit properly. So I don't think that I need to take off very much length. I'm just going to undo this last orbiting ring. And also notice that I've finished here, the end of my chain. I have just an empty pair of rings on the end of my chain. That is how you want your chain to end. You don't want to end with an orbit. So I'm going to go ahead, take out this last orbiting ring, and I'm going to take off the 2 pairs on the end that will leave me with that final empty pair next to the orbit, and I will see how that length will work for me. So now that I've taken off a little bit of length, my bracelet will still end up being about 7.5 inches. So I can either just live with it or take off a little bit more length. I'm going to take off a little bit more length, which again, I will take out this very last orbiting ring. And take off the part of my 2 and 2 chain, which in this instance is these last 2 links, leaving myself again an empty pair of rings on the end of my chain as opposed to an orbited link. Now if your chain ended up being too short, once again all you need to do is just add a few extra pairs of rings to the end of your chain, and then add the orbits till you reach the end. Okay, now with my clasp I should have a 7-inch bracelet, so I'm going to go ahead and attach my clasp. Okay, now we're ready to add our clasp, and I'm going to be using 2 of these 3mm 18 gauge jump rings to attach my clasp to either end of my chain. You may need a couple more jump rings if you need a tiny bit more length and you want to add some length to the bar end of your toggle. You may need a couple more of these jump rings. I don't find that I have a problem just using a single jump ring to attach each end of my clasp and still be able to get the bar up through the ring side of the toggle with just by attaching it with just one ring to the end of the chain. So I'm going to take, now I've opened both of these little 3mm 18 gauge jump rings, and I'm just going to go ahead and hook the pair of rings on the end of my chain to my little jump ring, and take 1/2 of my clasp and slide it onto that little jump ring, and go ahead and close it like so. And then I'll come to the other end of my chain. Go ahead and take your paper clip off and take your other little open jump ring. Go ahead and hook it to the pair on the other end of your chain and slide the bar of your toggle on, or the other end of your clasp, whatever type of clasp you end up using, and close that ring up. So I just tried my bracelet on, and I was having a little bit of trouble actually getting the bar end of my toggle up through the ring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my other two little 3mm jump rings and add a couple more to the bar end of my toggle so that I don't have to struggle quite so much to get this bracelet on. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up the little ring that's holding the bar to the end of the chain. If I can find the opening of the jump ring, there we go. So I'm just going to open that, close it back up again. And I have two more of these 18 gauge 3mm jump rings. I'm going to take an open one and I'm going to hook it into the little one that's already attached to the end of my chain. So I'm going to add a total of 3 jump rings here to actually attach my bar, the bar of my toggle, to the end of my chain. So there's 2. And I'll take the last one, hook it into that last little ring that's on the end of my chain. Now I'll go ahead and reattach the bar of my toggle clasp and close up that final jump ring. Now let's try this again, see if it works a little bit better. Aha, that was much easier. Now the orbital ring chain can be used either as a bracelet or as a necklace. Like I said earlier, you would need about twice as many jump rings to do the necklace as you would to make the bracelet. And this necklace is about 15.5 inches, and it's got, I think, 92 or 93 jump rings in it total. If you're going to make this chain into a necklace, it does have a tendency to roll while it's on your neck if you don't have some sort of centerpiece to weight it down in the middle. So if you're going to do a necklace, I highly recommend that you hang some sort of stone or pendant from the center of it to give it a little bit of weight so it doesn't roll quite as much. It will roll around a little bit, but not quite as much if it has a pendant on it. And the bracelet, well, here's the bracelet I just made with the pre-oxidized rings and the shiny rings as the orbits. And then this is just all the shiny silver. And you can play with oxidizing maybe the orbiting rings instead. On my necklace, I oxidized the whole piece and then scrubbed off the surface oxidation, so it made the rings a little darker and made the pattern of the chain stand out a little bit more. I've also used a box clasp on the necklace as opposed to a toggle. And on this clasp, you can pretty much use any type of clasp that you so desire. It's versatile for just about anything you want to do with it. Thank you so much for joining me today to make the orbital ring chain. I hope you had a great time. If you wanted to make this chain in a slightly smaller, more delicate link, you could go ahead and use a smaller jump ring, which would be a 4.5 millimeter jump ring in the 18 gauge wire. And like I said, that will make a smaller, more delicate chain. You can also try making this chain into earrings. I have not tried that yet, but it's definitely a possibility. Maybe a link or two of the orbits on an ear wire would be super. So experiment with this chain. It's very versatile and a lot of fun, quite beautiful. So play, have fun. Thanks for joining me. Bye.